Welcome to Text on Text. This is Jed Sunwall. Today we're talking to Max Lenormand. Max is a geospatial data scientist and the host of a great podcast called Minds Behind Maps that he's been doing for quite a while. His podcast was actually a huge inspiration for this podcast. He does incredibly thoughtful interviews with people who work in the geospatial sector, people who work in mapping, and just learns about them, learns about who they are, what their motivations are. And he's a fantastic interviewer. And I was on his podcast a year or so ago and have gotten to know him. And I think, we just see the world in very similar ways and are really interested in getting behind technology and learning more about what motivates people to create it. So he was a natural guest for this podcast, and I'm really grateful to him for coming on because he prompted me to read these two fantastic books, The Little Prince and Night Flight by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. As you listen on, you're going to find that, Max, as a person from France, as a French person, has a lot of insight and personal insight into the history of aviation in France and into the character of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and what he and these books have meant to him as he grew up. This is a great conversation. I mean, obviously, I'm biased here. I thought it was a great conversation, but part of it is because Max sort of flipped things around and interviewed me quite a bit, which I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that he did that because I listened to his podcast. He's really good at this. And so this is a long conversation. We get really deep into life. It's very personal. And I just really enjoyed it. And I'm really grateful to Max for coming on. So I hope you enjoy. See you on the other side. All right. Welcome, Max, to Text on Text. Today we have Max Lenormand. One of the inspirations for this podcast, for sure. He runs a podcast called Minds Behind Maps. But yeah, Max, welcome. How do you describe what you do these days?
First of all, I'm very excited to chat together. I get excited when people decide to start podcasts and just putting more stuff out there and conversations. So I'm very excited and I'm honored to be here. I run Minds Behind Maps. It's been going on for 3 years. You've been on. And the way I just describe it is talking to people who build and think about anything that really has to do with mapping, maps, satellite images, anything like journalists, authors, engineers, policymakers, anybody that's even remotely related to it. I think it's interesting and I want to talk to them.
Great.
And I'm also a data scientist. That's the thing that actually pays the bills, but that's the less visible part of what I do as well.
Okay. And so do you consider yourself a technologist?
Yeah, I know you asked this question, so I was thinking about it, and I kind of want to say yes, but I think my rationale for that has changed over time. It's become a bit different, more nuanced. I started going to engineering school. I went to aerospace engineering school. That's kind of my education, professional education, at least. I went to high school and then engineering school. I really liked aviation when I was a teenager. Like, I just obsessed over it. And through that, engineering. My dad's also an engineer. And so I got access to, asking a lot of questions. And I just thought it was so interesting to understand how machines work, like mechanically, not software, but just like how gears work, how planes fly is still this magical, weird thing. And when I was about 12, we moved right in front of a tiny little airfield. France. So I'm French, and France is the country with the second most licensed pilots in the world. The U.S. is number one.
But is that per capita, or
I think it's
absolute?
Absolute.
Wow.
And that's not like professional. It's just people who have a driving license, but a license to fly planes. So there's France is like one of the birthplaces of aviation as well. So you'll have people that say it's the Wright brothers that started it. If you go to France, they'll tell you it's some other guy that's French, of course. I mean, it's disputed and everything, but I was really lucky to grow up in that, and it really fosters some of that. And so it started with, I'm very curious about the engineering and all of that. And then slowly over time, I think the reason why I've stayed and I've changed, I'm not a mechanical engineer in aviation, is kind of the incentives that the world puts around you. And there's this thing that's been really just stuck in my brain, and I just cannot get rid of it. I had Steve Coast on the podcast a couple years ago, so the founder of OpenStreetMap.
Yeah.
And he said this idea that software is the only thing that's not illegal. And at first I was
remember that.
What?
Yeah.
And so, and then he digs into it, and his whole point is like, you don't need to ask anybody's permission to start a website. And it's a little bit large. You don't need, a podcast is the same thing. But basically, there's this thing where if you are an individual and you just want to tinker on stuff, well, actually, software is one of the last things where you can kind of do whatever the heck you want. And so I've thought about that, where it's this interesting thing of, if you're just this kid that's has ideas and wants to change things, you're not going to go and do policy. Like, you just can't really do that. Like you can start a website and you can be like, I'm going to make this process easier. And so it kind of funnels people into that.
Yeah.
And I think I identify as like a person that wants to like make things different. I get annoyed when things are just not the way they should be, or like counterintuitive or whatever. And so I think I've just been funneled towards like that engineering mindset, towards like making stuff, and then it becomes software, because that's where, as an individual, you don't really need to ask anybody. And so I think I'm now, part of thinking about technology, but because it's where it's easiest to start having an impact, which is not what got me here in the first place.
Interesting. Okay. Can I ask you a little bit more about like what it means to you to be an engineer? Like you sort of started to consider yourself an engineer.
I think it's defined a lot by what it means in France. Like, engineer is a protected title, like a doctor. Like, you can't say, "Oh, I'm a doctor." Like, I'm going to put that on my resume, and now I'm going to be a doctor. Like, engineer is sort of the same thing in France. France is an old country. The schools that it has are these old institutional schools. They're military based. A lot of it started around Napoleon.
Wow.
And so this notion of engineer, there's like, a person that knows how to fix stuff and build things, but there's also this like protected title. And so when I say I did an engineering school, it's really sort of an artifact of the French school system, where we don't really talk about bachelor's and master's. Like I learned what a bachelor's degree and a master's degree was when I was like 23, and I had to start talking to people in English about like what did I have, what education I had. So it's very much rooted in that notion, and in the like problem solving. Technical problem solving. So you have a problem, you're going to go understand the physics, the maths, and then the programming language, and that all derives from there. And I think I tied that very much to my identity for a really long time. Like, I'm that thing over there. Like the people that are building the things. Yeah.
If you don't mind me repeating it back to you, the definition has something to do with kind of like a more rigorous approach to being curious and understanding how things work.
I think so, yeah. But I think there are many, many more people that are curious and have that rigor that are not engineers. I do think curiosity is just this thing that's really important, that I feel very much a part of what I am and do. Sometimes people make a remark to you just offhanded, and like it just, you keep it for your whole life, and they an hour later they forgot about it. And I had this teacher, this biology teacher in high school, and we had this parent teacher meeting, whatever, and he kind of told me and my parents, like, it doesn't really matter what you do, and like the biology is not going to matter. What you really need to keep is the curiosity. Like, you seem to be a curious kid, like keep that. And he just said it with like such a seriousness that like I just never heard someone say before. And I was like, oh, that sounds wise. And I don't even know if it was, but just like when you're 16 and someone tells you that, you're like, oh, okay, that sounds important. And I think, yeah, curiosity is something that I think is just so incredible. And for me, it's turned into like mechanical stuff and now software and just physics and things like that. But no matter what it is, I think like this compass of I'm just going to follow things I think are interesting. I think it's an amazing compass in life. Like I'm just going to follow the curious stuff. And yeah.
Okay. I love this. Well, this is all, I don't know. Well, so I'll introduce the works that we're going to discuss, because I think this is all relevant. Everything you're saying can be tied to the works of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Now, how would you say his name?
Antoine de Saint-Exupéry.
Oh, I love it. I love French is so crazy to me. I love it. So we read The Little Prince. Yeah. Which was always like around when I was growing up. And, and it has these cute drawings on it that apparently he drew.
Yep.
And I always thought it was like a kid's book. But when I was a little kid, I could never read it. I was like, I don't know what's going on here. Like I remember seeing the drawing of the hat, of the boa, and being like, okay, this is kind of silly and funny, but I could just never get into the book. Never quite understood it. It was always confusing to me because it seemed like a kid's book. And then we'll discuss Night Flight, which when I initially posted about this podcast, I asked people on LinkedIn for tips on fiction books that inspire technology. And a friend of mine, John Turo, here in Seattle, he recommended Night Flight because he said that Bill Gates apparently was inspired by it to create like Flight Simulator, Microsoft Flight Simulator. So anyway, so we read these two books, but I want to get your perspective as a Frenchman on the author and what Saint-Exupéry is sort of meant to you in your life. I mean, is also as a someone interested in aviation.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, so we had mentioned that. Like, I'm really not. I don't think that story about Bill Gates starting Flight Simulator, reading Night Flight is true, because he didn't start Flight Simulator,
right?
But we can get into that because I have a lot of thoughts on that as well. But yeah, Saint-Exupéry is this thing where The Little Prince was always around. Like, I think for most people, if you look at statistics, it's most likely a book that's been around because it's the most translated and most sold book ever after the Bible. So in terms of like influence, you can't have a book that's just more well known than The Little Prince. And so if whatever we talk about here, people have probably said before, like the expectation that we're going to come up with something new is just, it's not there. The book is, it came out in 1944, I think 1944. So it's like 80 years old now. Interestingly enough, I was looking this up. It's not public domain in France, and like the US and a couple other countries, because Saint-Exupéry died for the country, and so you get like extra rights that your book is protected for longer. So if you're in any other country than I think France, the US, maybe Belgium and Germany, like you can read it for free anywhere. But if you're in those countries, you still have to buy it, which is just a fun, interesting thing about like authors. But yeah, I like this idea that most people probably have heard about Saint-Exupéry for The Little Prince, and just imagine this guy's probably like a kid's author or whatever. And it's this book that just has nothing to do with whatever he wrote before. He's an aviator and the journalist originally. Like, he grew up in a very well-off family, and he had a really great childhood, but he just got drawn to planes, and he wanted to start flying planes. And it was at a time, he's born in 1900, which makes it very easy to know what age he is at any point in his life. Like, oh, he does this in 1932. Well, he's 32 years old. So it's this character that's like, you hear about all the, like, you've heard about at some point, but then you dig into the character and you learn more about him. And I just find that very interesting. And The Little Prince is something that I've probably read like 5-6 times in my life. Like, I don't think I ever wrote it read it as a kid, but you come across it as a kid because it's just so big and popular. You probably see a cartoon of it or something. And yeah, it's one of those books that I feel like is nice to reread every once in a while to not take yourself too seriously. But then reading who the guy behind it is, I don't know. I find the reason I've been drawn to Saint-Exupéry lately is because he's this character that's hard to put in a mold. Like if you ask him, like, what is he? And if you could pick one, what are you? It doesn't really work. He's as much an aviator as he is an author, and you can't have one without the other because he writes about flying. His first book is Courrier Sud, which is like South Mail, if you had to translate it. The second one, Night Flight. Then he does Wind, Sand, and Storms. He writes a lot about like what it's like to fly. And he writes to take the pressure off flying and when he's bored. So it's like this thing where he writes about the thing he does, but he has to write to keep doing the thing that he does. Otherwise, it's just like he can't put those two things together. And I find that very interesting because I've found myself to be a little bit in the same situation. I'm not an author. I'm not a journalist, but I like thinking and talking about the people in the industry that I'm in. And I'm more and more drawn towards wanting to tell the stories of the people in this industry rather than being the best engineer, to what we were, to tie it back earlier. And I've been wrestling with that idea of, do I want to go all in into becoming the best software engineer, data science that I want, or do I want to be an outsider that tells the story looking back in? And then all of a sudden I rediscover this guy who's actually been both for his whole life, but struggled with it his whole time. So Night Flight, when it comes out, is like the big success. It's his second book. I think it comes out in 1932, something like that. And it's just a massive success. And there's jealousy because he's talking about, it's a fiction. The main story is about the aéropostale, which is the aerial post. This is after World War One. People have cranked out airplanes for World War One, and suddenly the war ends, and you just have a ton of airplanes, and people don't know what to do with them. But you have airplanes, and you have people who've flown airplanes for a really long time, and who kind of really want to fly them again. And so some people start realizing that you can put airmail, so letters, correspondence, bills, like, the whole world runs on paper at the time. And so they start opening a line between Toulouse, I think in the south of France, that goes along the coast of Africa, over the Atlantic, and then all the way down into South America. And so it's this business, basically this business endeavor. Can we justify we have all this material, all these people that are qualified, like there might be an opportunity here. And so he talks about, through fiction, like basically what it's like to do that. And people find it really interesting because he's an author that has something to say. Like he's not just writing to write. Like he has, if you read his books, like he knows what he's talking about. He talks about the dials and, the sound that the plane makes. Like it's a guy that knows what he's talking about. And I don't know, I've felt drawn towards that specifically recently as I'm trying to figure out like what the heck I want to do in my own life. And it's interesting to read about someone that, died 80 years ago, but actually went through something very similar in a time where technology was completely different, but people are still the same.
Yeah. No, I mean, let's talk about Night Flight first, I think, and then we can go into more discussion of the Little Prince at the end. You've explained sort of the conceit of Night Flight quite well, like where it came about. The policy on the podcast, everyone should know, we're going to spoil every book we talk about. So
it's a very short book. If you want to go read it.
It's a very short book. Yeah, you can read it. It's, the English translation I have is 87 pages. Be forewarned. I mean, it took me still a couple of days to read. I'm busy, right? So I don't have like a ton of time to read, but it's a dense book. Like it is a beautifully written, like rich text. At least the English translation that I read. If anyone's read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, it's also like not a super long book, but it's just like every sentence is like a poem. It's just kind of like mind blowing. It's kind of like on par with that, and almost.
I'm not aware of that one, but I'll take your word for it.
Blood Meridian, it's a doozy. But yeah, it's a cool book. But yeah, the point being though is just so like he's a very evocative writer, very poetic writer, like really rich descriptions of things. And then it's such a strange book because so much of it takes place in the head of this guy Riviere, who is like the commander, and he seems to be the sort of the driving force behind this notion of like having airmail fly at night, where he's like, we're going to make airmail. It was great to hear you say aéropostale in French, because that's how we say it. Like, we're going to make this into an industry, and we're losing against terrestrial transport because we can't do it at night. So I'm going to push these men to fly at night, even though it's supremely dangerous, because we just hadn't like figured out how to do it. There's this huge conflict within him. He demands that his, middle managers be very hard on people. He says, you have to love your men, but they can never know that you do, because what they're doing is so dangerous and unproven. He's just like, everyone has to be extremely rigorous and careful because it's dangerous. I can't let anybody think that they can slip up at all for any reason whatsoever. But within him, you realize like he himself is mortal. Like there's evidence that he's sick, he's getting older, and he's just kind of like dealing with it. He's like, what have I done with my life? Who am I to send these men potentially to their death? And of course, the story ends with a sort of, the main thrust of the story is a flight from Patagonia that doesn't make it to Buenos Aires because it gets caught in a storm, and the pilot presumably dies. Like it's never clear, but like it's pretty clear.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
So there's a lot of parallels with like real stories, which is also why like it was a bit of a contentious book with within his peers, because the Saint-Exupéry's life is basically like he was trying to fly as much as he could. Like he's just a guy. He's born in 1900, which, he's born like planes are not a thing. People don't think you can fly.
Yeah.
And when he's 10, planes are starting to be a thing, and he lives like right by an airfield, and he just starts showing up again and again, and eventually like someone takes him on a flight, and it's just like mind-blowing, mind-expanding thing, especially as a kid. And then from there on, he's just going to do whatever he can to keep on flying. And so he ends up as part of Aéropostale. Actually, he's a pilot in the Aéropostale, which is what he writes about. And I don't know if it's written in your edition, but like the book is, I forgot what the word is, but he says it's dedicated to this guy called Didier Dora. So I have it here. It's on the first page. It's in French. It's à Monsieur Didier Dora. If my camera wants to put it here, and you can Google this guy. And Didier Dora is basically Rivière. He's basically the guy who was in charge of the pilots and the planes for Aéropostale in the 20s and early 30s. And he's this iron fist of a character. It's this. Yeah. If you read him up, it's like everybody fears him, but a lot of people really admire him, and like maybe as much people despise him. And it's this tension between he takes on these pilots that are, they're 20 years old, they're 25. They want to prove themselves. They think they're on top of the world. And this guy's going to mold these kids into doing very, very risky work, but also it pays for them to be able to fly. So in the book, he comes across as this huge bastard, but the context of the story is like, this is the guy that allows them to fly as well.
Got it.
And so it's this really complicated thing where like they it's like a military recruitment where this is going to be a real hard, kid. But if nobody's forcing you to be here. And you have this moment where Fabien, which is the pilot, wakes up in the morning and his wife is, really loving, but he's just looking out at the sky and just really wants to go. Like you can tell like these people are drawn towards that. And I think there's something interesting here between this character as this like strong iron fist that is not going to show humanity, even though if he cares for these people, but he's not holding them hostage either. And he questions himself. And I just find that fascinating. And I can't help to think that there's a lot of parallels to startups today, basically, which is why I started talking about the history of aéropostale is really like a business decision. Like you ended up with like planes and pilots, and like, how can we make money with this to just keep them flying? Because if you're a plane manufacturer, you just had the government was your biggest customer for 4 years, and then all of a sudden nobody's buying your planes anymore. So it's even plane manufacturers, La Décoère was one of them in France, that starts the aerial post, because they're like, you know how the Michelin guide, you've probably heard about it, the people that give the stars, that's the tire company, because they were like, the best way to sell tires is to get people to drive, and we're going to give them a reason to. And so I think about the modern startup where you can have like these very strong characters. Like you take an Elon, for example, like people think of him as this guy that's just going to keep on going. Maybe the way he is now has changed, but you take the like early SpaceX Elon, let's say, and there's some parallels with that, with the people are just gravitating towards these characters. They want to do the work. Like you want to build the next big rocket, and it's going to be really hard. And this is what it takes. Difference is here, people ended up dying. But it's this really interesting read as well. Like if you look at it through the lens of these people are in a race. He has this line where, if I live translate, I know you've done this before, but he says like, this is a life or death question. Like we lose each night the advance that we've gained. And then during the day, the ships and trains take back. So it's really this thing. They're not just doing it for fun. Like they're doing it. Otherwise they go under. And this is the price they have to take. So, this is the equivalent of like debugging late nights and pushing code. And like the stakes are a bit different, but there's a lot of interesting parallels there in what basically happened 100 years ago.
That's right. No, and what's the other interesting parallel is that they're describing creating a communication network, right? It's still just transferring information, right? So it's just this very analog version of it where it was like, this podcast is basically an MP3 that's going to go out and be delivered to people via an RSS feed. We can go to the details of like how that works, but like no young man will have to fly to deliver this message to anybody, and leave his wife. So the stakes are different, but it's all the same thing. And I think what's so fascinating to me is that the book is this meditation on like, what is this other thing that we do as humans that transcends our own relationships and love, like the vision of somebody sacrificing their relationships for their career or for some corporation or for some other larger goal. It's a pretty common thing. And this book just really looks very hard at that through, Riviere's sort of internal monologue that like what we're doing here is bigger than ourselves. And it's even bigger than, in many cases, like some of the most like intimate and important things that people have in their lives, which are like their relationships. And, and he's obviously tortured by this. He's just like, who am I? Yeah. What authority do I have to put these men in danger? But to your point, like they wanted to go, like they want to be part of something else. And this is actually also a theme of The Little Prince. I feel like he says it explicitly. In fact, I've got this note here, like when he finds the geographer in The Little Prince.
Yeah. I'm glad you bring this up. So maybe we can give it.
Yeah.
It's the most popular book ever, but we can still give some context around the Little Prince.
Okay. Well, let me just find this part, because he finds this geographer, because the Little Prince is going from planet to planet and finding these the king and the drunkard and all these other people. And he's like, he finds this geographer, and he's like, this person is the least absurd person that I found, because he's obsessed with something other than himself.
Yeah, I actually wrote that down as well.
Okay. And so that's kind of I think that is like a very strong theme between these two books, is this notion that like our work, our labor, where like in our like potential immortality as people actually comes from us surrendering ourselves to something greater than ourselves, or something other than ourselves, which I think is quite beautiful. And that's the burden that Riviere has. He's like, we're building something that's bigger than all of us, and this is incredibly painful to do. So anyway, I'll stop there, and then you can explain. Well, I'll just
there's this. It's interesting to hear you say that, because these people are quite selfish in the sense that we still are. That like they want to do this thing because it's cool.
Right.
Like if you really distill it, like they want to do it because it's really cool. Like they want to fly because it's cool, and it's not like because they're young. Like Saint-Exupéry when World War II starts to be like older, just because he is, by the time World War II is around, and he just wants to fly a P-38 Lockheed Lightning, which is like the most badass plane of the time. It's like this twin engine. It's called like the Devil's Tails or something. It's this incredibly powerful plane. So you got to realize this guy, planes don't exist. He's 10. He's flying on like wooden canvas and strings. 20s comes around, he's flying on these 5-ton still wooden airplanes, big engine, oily, leaky everywhere. And then World War II comes around, and it's just like the pace keeps on going up, and he sees this airplane that's the P-38, and you can go look it up, like what it looks like. It's a huge plane. It's twin engine, but a single person inside. And he's like, I want to fly that thing. But just like a kid that's like, I want that candy. And he knows he's unreasonable. And he's going to pull like every string he can. He's going to go through his editor. He's going to, like what you would see is like, oh, it's just kind of selfish. But like, you sort of understand like that thrill of wanting to basically play with the coolest toy around. But he has to find a way to make it part of the war effort. And so there's this interesting part of him as well that is about the thing that drives him is doing this very individual thing. He's not like, he tries to take people flying, but he crashes with someone else and he injures them and he nearly kills someone else in the process. He breaks a few ribs in an accident. So there's this interesting parallel between like the character himself, like Saint-Exupéry, the person, and then the things that he talks about in his books. And I think that they're not mutually exclusive, but they're interesting to understand the character behind how he wrote that. And so to get to the Little Prince, it's written in this very, very simple language, which I always admire people who are able to speak and elaborate complicated ideas in the most simple of language. And it's this story of a pilot, of course, because it's Saint-Exupéry, who meets this little prince, which is this character that's kind of like fallen from the sky, and who lives in this a bit absurd world where he lives on a tiny little planet with 3 volcanoes and a rose. And he just
one of the volcanoes is dead.
Yeah, one of the volcanoes is dead, but he's still taking care of it because you never know. And he's this basically like embodiment of a child, which is always going to ask questions, doesn't really care about yours, and is just going to keep asking a question and can really read through people, like just really cuts through people. And through their BS. Like it's really like a child, and it has this purity that like as the character grows to learn about the Little Prince, it just wants to care about him and protect him. And so this Little Prince is basically hurt because he has a rose that he takes care of, and she's very pretty, but she's also very vain, and she doesn't really seem to care about him as much. And so he's a bit hurt by that, and just decides to go on a trip, and he meets all these people on these little planets. So he meets a king, he meets this is like, maybe you have them in English, I have them in French. There's you said the drunkard, there's a lamplighter. That's how I translate it. There's
the lamplighter. Yeah, that's
right. Vain person. I don't know how it's translated in English, but there are all these people who basically are like some of the flaws in people. The king just wants to rule over everybody, even if he has nothing to rule over. This vain person just thinks he's the best, even if there's no reason for him. There's this line about the drunkard that I really like. So I'm paraphrasing, but he basically drinks to forget, and he forgets. So it's to forget his shame, and it's his shame of drinking. And it's just these like untied sentences where like you don't really know where you're going each time, and by the time you come back, it's basically a circle. And there's this lamplighter, I call him, which is this person that turns on a lantern on and off. And it's this guy who's basically following protocol that made sense a long time ago, but just doesn't anymore. But he's still following protocol. And then one of the final people he meets is this geographer, which I think is amazing to this conversation. And in a way, like so close to what modern geographers are. So he's a geographer, and he describes to the Little Prince his work as, I'm the person that basically knows where all the mountains and all the rivers and everything is. But I can't tell you any individual one, because I need explorers. Like, I can't go out there, and I need explorers. And you're an explorer. You come from somewhere, so now you're going to have to tell me, but I need to be able to trust you. And so there's this whole conversation where this guy's like very important, but he actually doesn't do the job himself. Which is like, it's so interesting with, Earth observation is basically the explorers that we have today, and we're the geographers, but we're still just sitting there, and we can't actually go and do it ourselves. There's so many great things to. This book makes you think about just how you can apply so many things to your own life, and especially if you work in geography. It's great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what's surprising to me, I mean, it's not surprising to me. Well, hang on. It is surprising to me that this is the second most translated, printed, whatever book behind the Bible. But it's a wisdom book.
Yeah.
But then my question is like, I never hear about The Little Prince. I don't know what circles I'm running in. Like I said, it was always around when I was growing up. I never read it, but I never hear people talk about it. But it is a profound book about like what it means to be a human, like what being human is like, what it's like just existing in this universe. And then sort of the folly of thinking that we can understand things, like that's the thing about the geographer. It's like, yeah, I know about like all the geography, but like I don't actually ever go see it myself. There's nothing that like I can do with this information. And it's a theme throughout the story, this idea that like it's in the fourth chapter. He has this line, and what's great about this book is that it has just so many powerful moments that are just throwaway lines. And he says, but of course, those of us who understand life couldn't care less about numbers. There's over and over again, there's the Little Prince encounters quantities of things, like people who are like, there's the businessman who wants to count the stars because he wants to own the stars. Somewhere on Earth, he finds a rose garden where there are tons of roses, and he finds out he's just one boy of many boys. Like, and there's anyway these encounters with quantities of things in the world, and then the realization that like it doesn't matter how many of anything there are. Like, we're all just kind of like. Well, there's also the notion of like ephemerality. Like we're all just here for a moment. And it's this amazing thing.
The geographer also says that like he doesn't care about things that are ephemeral. So the Little Prince starts describing his planet, and he says, I have 3 volcanoes. And the geographer says, oh, great. And says, and I have a rose. And he's like, I don't care about roses. Because it's ephemeral.
Yeah, that's right.
And so he just moves on. And the Little Prince is like, what does ephemeral mean? And then I forget what the geographer tells him, but it's basically like, oh, it's not important enough. And he's
That's
like
right.
baffled because, the rose is basically it's women
That's right.
In the story.
It seems to be a metaphor for women. Yeah.
It is a metaphor for women. Like Saint-Exupéry's wife, I forgot her name. She has this convoluted name. She wrote a book that she never published. And it's called The Memories of the Rose. And it's basically like her point of view on their marriage. So it's like very directly about women and his relationship with his wife. It's a different point of view on like women than we would go on today. But like in that context, that's what it is. But yeah, it's what I find so interesting about this book is that there's no world in which Saint-Exupéry should have ever written that book. So he was a very famous author. He had publishers in New York, actually. Like he is this French author, but he spent a lot of time in the US, and a lot of his books are even published in English before they're published in French. Some of his later books. So one that's very influential is in French. It's called Pilote de Guerre, which is a war pilot. I think that's the one that becomes. That's one of the books that he writes as like what it was like to fly as a pilot in the very early World War II, because the U.S. is very unsure about getting into World War II in 1940. Like it's just like we're not going to deal with this, and he flees to New York, and he feels ashamed of basically fleeing. And his editors push him, and he ends up writing this book, which is like, hey, this is what happened. And it's part of this effort to get the U.S. involved and say like, hey, this is what's going on. Like people really fought here. Now there's this sort of joke that like France surrendered and French people are surrenderers. I mean, like that's going on already at the time. And like he wants to show like what it was like to actually fight and be a pilot and like these brave people. So he's making, in the eyes of the Little Prince, like what the adults and the grown-ups would do, like these very important, very serious things.
Yeah.
And all his other books, like, Night Flight, they're these serious, heavy-hitting books. Like you read that and you're like, you take a moment, you lean back and you think about it after. But there are these very serious topics with very serious problems. And the Little Prince is like, sort of rejects that. And so if you look at like, what is the natural evolution of this author in 1943, like 1 year before he dies, like he's written all these things. It's not, he's going to write a book for children that's like thinking about what grown-ups problems are. And I use grown-ups because that's what he uses to describe what the Little Prince uses to describe like grown-up adults. And they have these made-up problems and they don't care about the beauty of things. And I find that so interesting as well. Like it's not just a guy who's been pumping out children book after children book. Like this is a huge departure from what he's done before as well. And there's, I think, something that makes it even better in that sense that like, it feels like maybe he was fed up, with making the serious stuff and like, I'm going to try a different way to get at people. And I have something else that I need to put out there. And it's not something that anybody had asked him to do compared to the other books. Sometimes we have this notion that earlier authors, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, they wrote out of this purity of spirit. And now it's so financially and motivated. It was very financially motivated back at the time. Like he has editors pushing him to come out with a new thing. And that is not what they're asking for. And I think there's something interesting about the whole context in which this book comes out as well. That when you read it, for me at least, adds a whole other layer compared to the first times where I read it, where if it just falls on your lap, you're like, oh, this is an interesting book. And there's some wisdom to it. But I just can't help but try to think why he wrote something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is helpful context that I didn't have. I mean, thinking about it now, with the understanding that, he's, I guess, a superstar pilot.
Oh,
I mean, so
yes.
yeah.
He goes when he's in New York in 42, 43. Like, he's ashamed that he lives this like luxurious life in New York, where he knows that half of the country got invaded, and the other half is basically trying to fight back. There's this famous General de Gaulle, which is the freed France forces, and he's trying to spur up people to keep fighting from Brittany. So there's this deep sense of shame in him, but also like he doesn't really want to go back either. And so this really imbalance in him in trying to figure out how he wants to deal with things. This is a book that's written during World War II. Like there's that context as well.
Right. So there's so much going on here in the sense that, like, of course he's going to be a celebrated author at this time because he's one of like very few humans who's ever like flown. I mean, like almost nobody's ever flown, and he has this perspective on the world that is actually, extremely rare. I mean, the scenery in Night Flight, he describes when the pilot finally makes his way above the clouds and is flying, in the moonlight under the stars over these clouds. It's just like, it's so beautiful. And so, I mean, it's like heartbreaking now, like knowing that he died on a flight over the Mediterranean, like, met a similar fate. But he has this perspective that's just incredible. So you can understand why he would be like an author in demand. And he's also just a great writer. But yeah, The Little Prince, it reminds me kind of Kurt Vonnegut in a sense. So I don't know if you know much about Vonnegut.
I've read Slaughterhouse-Five, is it? A long time ago. I have just faint memories of it.
So Vonnegut is a fascinating guy, but also a World War II veteran. And he was, I might be wrong about this, but I think I'm not. He was a prisoner of war in Dresden. When the U.S. firebombed Dresden, basically destroys Dresden. I mean, just like a absolute obliteration of the city. And he somehow survives that. And he emerges from that not understanding why he's alive. Like it just had this huge impact on his life. He's just like, how on earth, like, what is going on here? Like, this makes no sense at all that, like, I survived this beautiful city that had been there, for centuries, destroyed, and somehow he emerges from it. And that had a huge impact on him. And I don't know, I might be projecting a little bit, but I see some of that going on in The Little Prince, is that, he's obviously confronted his own mortality a bunch of times already. I mean, this is also a story based on him crashing in the Sahara, which is a harrowing experience. And so he has a very unique perspective on like what it is to be a human, and on life that I just think is unique. And yeah, it's very weird that it comes out in this form, which is ostensibly a kid's book, but this is not a kid's book. Like no kid understands this book.
He actually, I don't think he crashed into the desert. Like if you go into his life, he was one to. I've just really been digging into his life. Like I find it sometimes I find it helpful to take a distance from the day-to-day world and just learn about people a longer while ago. So I've kind of been obsessed with Saint-Exupéry lately. To caveat that, but he was at this place called Cap Juby, and he was like the manager of one of the stop pits, basically. We talked about Aéropostale, and so people don't take off from France and go all the way to South America. Like they basically hop around. And so there's these little areas in the middle of nowhere. So either along the coast of Spain and then the coast of North Africa and then South America. And so you need to have people in there in charge, a little bit like the Pony Express. Actually, they talk about the analogy of the Pony Express, which was this grand attempt at connecting both sides of the US. And so you'd have these relay points. I think that's a better way to talk about it. And so he's for a couple years in charge of one of these relay points, which he does not like because he's not the one flying. And that is spent with a lot of time just waiting around. It's a place in a pretty desertic area. I forget where it is on the map. But he stays there for like a year and a half, 2 years. And part of his job is making sure that the pilots can rest, but also going and fetching pilots that are downed, because these are very unreliable planes back at the time.
Right.
And these are really harsh conditions. So he's more of a manager, would be the equivalent today. But he goes fetch people whose planes went down. And the thing that's kind of wild today is he also needs to manage tribes of people that are around that don't like the idea of planes flying over their territory. And so there's this danger aspect. Like, some pilots end up taking in ransom because the tribes soon figure out these pilots are very valuable. Sometimes they kill the pilots. Like, it's this kind of weird, dangerous, very monotonous life that can all of a sudden be very exciting and like very intense. So I don't think he ever got down, but he lived in this place, was just like waiting around for a long time, for like a year and a half in the desert as well. Wow. And I think that's where he really started to write. I might be wrong on that, but I think Koyesud, his first book, really comes out of that.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, he's bored. He's a great writer, though. I mean,
I think
what
there
a guy.
is part of that.
Incredible.
Yeah, he's bored, but then there's also I don't know why people write, like a lot of people don't write because they're bored. Like, it's also because you just have this urge to start doing it.
No, he's a fascinating figure. I mean, again, I've never read anything by him until this past month, and but I'm obsessed. Like, somebody needs to make a movie. Reading Night Flight, I was like, I want Christopher Nolan to make a movie.
They made movies.
Okay. Well, I know there's a movie about Night Flight from 1933, and it looks ridiculous.
That's what I mean.
Okay. No, I want Christopher Nolan to make a movie.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I was just having images of. Have you seen Dunkirk?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The footage of the way they do the flying scenes in Dunkirk was just so beautiful, and I'm just like, okay, I want more of this.
Yeah. It's a really cool scenery. Dunkirk has this not very well known battle as well, and failure basically. There's this other thing that we had quickly touched on, but I'm getting at a point where I haven't lived in France for a long time now. My partner doesn't speak French, and I live in the Netherlands. But I grew up in France for, until I was basically 21. And so there's this thing where I'm starting to get to a point where I miss everything that I grew up around. I think you just reach this point in your life where oh, actually, this thing that I was just trying to get away from, I kind of miss it now. And so there's been, in the past couple years, I've just personally gone back to read French authors because I grew up around that. They're talking about places that I know, and they're talking about just the culture that I grew up around. And I live in the Netherlands, and I have for a few years now. I go back to France every once in a while. But there's just this weird thing of not really feeling like I'm around the place where I grew up with. I consider myself a citizen of the world. People say that sometimes. I really do think so. I'm incredibly grateful that I speak English. But in my life, speaking English is a recent thing. For the longest time, I just spoke mostly French. And now I speak mostly English. There are days upon days where I just don't speak French for a while.
Wow.
And there's been this urge of wanting to go back to France and then to aviation, which is really the first thing that I fell in love with. And so Saint-Exupéry is kind of this mix of both, on top of sprinkling this idea of, I want to tell stories. And this guy was very good at it. So it makes me excited that we're talking about this.
So you're the Saint-Exupéry of the 21st century.
I would not. I mean, the bar is very, very high. Dethroning the Little Prince is.
Yeah.
No, but this is a thing I struggle with. Is I've, to get into the tech side of things. I know I'm not the best. Rather, I don't want to become the best software engineer. I don't want to be the best machine learning engineer because I see what it takes. It's realizing I I really like running, but I'm not going to want to do what Usain Bolt does. First of all, I couldn't, but like the level of commitment that it takes is just like the competition around there is really hard. What I found so interesting is telling the stories of these people and these projects in the industry that we're in Earth observation, in satellite images, in mapping. I've been lucky. This ties back to the beginning of having conversations and podcasts, like just learning and discovering a lot of these stories, and being then turning around and being like, why is nobody telling these? And then wanting to try to take a shot at that. And so one recent example, well, it's a year ago now, but I put out a video explaining how satellite images work. It's this like 20-minute video. And I made it because I wanted to be able to show to my dad, like, what the heck I do. Like, that's really where it started. But now, like, 50,000 people have seen that thing, and it's being shown in classrooms, and it's like, whoa, okay, that's nice. That's helpful. That's cool. I think I can be good at this thing. But it's very different skill sets from being a good software engineer and being a good data scientist. And so I've been drawn to people who are trying to put all these pieces together as well. Like, one of my favorite nonfiction books is Range by, I think it's David Epstein. This idea that, like, if you want to be really good at something, you can either go the Tiger Woods route, which is just do golf your whole life and, like, you could be really good at that. Statistically speaking, there's just no way you're going to make it, though. Or you take a different approach, which is like, you can become the best person at reporting on golf, for example, or like I don't know, like anything. You take like different things and like you overlap them together. And I find people who have very orthogonal, to use a complicated word just for this one time, because I think it's such a cool word. So like
it's a
very
fun one.
opposite different things, and you bring them together. I find that fascinating. And so Exupéry is just one of those characters to me where he's really good at writing, but he's also a pilot. And so if you want to be good at writing, you have to be around authors and understand, like, he probably obsesses over sentence structures and like synonyms and stuff like that. Pilots just don't care at all. And then he has to figure out, like, how do I make this scene where they're changing oil interesting? Because if he's an author like that, most likely he obsessed over what he was doing. Like, one thing is just like incredibly gifted, he writes and boom, it comes out amazing. But the more human, more likely thing is probably he obsessed over his writing and just at least edited quite a lot. And I find this intersection of people who are very good at one thing, want to talk about that one thing. You need to obsess about talking about stuff. And I find myself, at least at this time in my life, in very drawn to this character for many reasons.
No, I think keep doing it. I obviously I think it's really important. I mean, I wouldn't have started this podcast if I didn't think language is supremely important. And I find myself also in the same situation. My day job at Radiant Earth, so much of the work is language. And is finding the right metaphors to, because we interact a lot with like policymakers, funders from, different philanthropies. And like, I'm always in this sort of like weird situation where I'm like, you guys need to understand how important GeoParquet is. Like, have you ever heard of GDAL? DuckDB is the new thing. But the truth is, like, these technologies are like step changes in terms of like our ability to share information with one another, to analyze information, makes it dramatically cheaper. And combined, these kinds of things have a really large impact on like what we can know about the world. So that ideally, some policymakers or people like who actually have authority to like make decisions that have huge impacts on us can make better decisions. But as you probably won't be surprised, a lot of the people in DC or Geneva or these ivory towers where a lot of policy gets made, they don't understand anything about the underlying technology. And I mean, in case you can't tell, if I go in there talking about Parquet and like columnar file formats, they're just going to be like, all right, see you later, nerd. You know, they don't have any. So figuring out how to explain these things in a way that will land is extremely hard work, but I also think it's extremely important work.
How much of your time are you trying to get better at explaining why things are important, or getting better at convincing? Not learning about the tech. I'm talking about that aspect of the craft, which like again, like you go to the people who are making GDL, like they just will never care about. Like we talk about like policymakers don't care about the column formats or whatever, but I want to flip that around.
Right.
Like how much of your time is spent like, I don't know, I'm gonna improve the way I speak because maybe that's important, or spend more time writing and actually editing what I do because the brevity is more important, or something like that. Do you spend a lot of your time doing that?
I think it's most of my time. And I also think that writing, I think most of my time is spent writing. And when I include within that time, going on walks and like staring out the window, right? Like just thinking. It's some line, I don't remember who said it, but it's some author. And there's, maybe some sexist undertones in this, but it's again, maybe Saint-Exupéry era author saying, he's just like, the hardest part of an author's job is convincing his wife that staring out the window is working or something like that. She's like, what are you doing? Like, why aren't you helping out? It's like, no, I'm working. Like, I'm just like sitting here thinking, and it's work. Radiant Earth is a nonprofit, and I've been doing this job for about 2 years. And my joke, but this is true, like it took me about a year to realize that my main job is fundraising. And that's what an executive director of a nonprofit does, is you have to raise money to keep the thing going. Fundraising is convincing people, and convincing people is finding the right language that will compel them to understand that what you're working on is important and that it matters. And I have created a challenging task for myself, because I do think that like understanding low-level technologies and funding them in the right way is really important. Whereas a lot of funders are like, oh, can you help save polar bears or, stop deforestation? And I'm like, I'm working way upstream from that kind of activity. And so getting people to understand sort of the levels of abstraction where we're working is super hard. So this is a long way of saying it's like, it's a huge part of my job.
What is the biggest takeaway that you think you've had in the past year after you realized that? Like, you said it, you've done this 2 years. Now it took you 1 year to realize that was your job. Like, what's the biggest, maybe even thing you change your mind on? That's a question I like asking sometimes. Like, what's the biggest realization that you've had on like how you need to be better at your job that you just probably wouldn't have figured out when you started?
Let me think about this. Boy, there's so much. I think,
like, high level idea, like staring out the window is, you can tell me like that's it as well. Like, I'll take it.
Oh, like staring out the window is like the most important part of it. I mean, I'll say, one thing I'll say is that one thing that I have learned over the years is that my best work is done walking, is going on long walks through the neighborhood, and thinking, then listening to music, usually like weird ambient stuff, because that's what I like. So like, that's actually extremely valuable, important time that I have to prioritize. Same thing with like, with practicing meditation, which I try to practice regularly, with varying degrees of success. Also staying physically fit. So it's this very weird thing. And these are things that I've known for a long time, but like actually being sort of like rigorous about my health. And like, there's this term self-care, which I kind of hate, because a lot of people are like, that's self-care. Like, I'm going to go like do nothing, and like lounge because I need to take care of myself. And I'm pretty opposed to that mentality. I believe in self-care in the sense that like, you should be really taking care of yourself. Like, exercising, getting enough sleep, stuff like that. Like that, it's something that I knew before, but I would say the challenges of running, and even in my case, a quite small nonprofit with a great team that's quite easy to manage. It's hard, and like if you don't take care of yourself, like you're doomed. So that might not be what you're looking for, but like that's definitely a lesson that I've learned over the past 2 years. Is like you can't sort of let yourself go if you're going to be leading an organization in this way. And also, like, if you're expected to come up with really like rock solid ideas that you can take to funders who are very scrutinous, like what's the word I'm trying to
Scrupulous?
Scrupulous, yeah, very rigorous in their thinking. Yeah, and also, I guess, also basically to riff a lot on sort of your work with the podcast, having conversations and workshopping ideas with people through conversation and language, I think is extremely valuable. And I think, I think a lot of people sort of get seduced by the idea that there's like some new technology that's going to save everything, fix everything. And I'm like, no, it's really just humans talking to each other. That's all it ever is. I mean, and again, going back to night flight, it's airmail. The whole thing is like figuring out how to get humans to communicate with each other more quickly. Like it's wild to me.
Yeah, I think there's a corollary to that I was thinking about. I also went on a walk to kind of process the book ahead of this conversation. And to get to startups again, one of my highest, most recommended reads, nonfiction as well, that came out like past 5 years, is 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman.
Oh yeah, I've listened to him talk about it. I haven't read it.
It's nothing new, but it's basically this idea. I'm a big believer. I'm going to go on a tangent of a tangent. I'm a big believer that like what we need, like the reason why we need more stuff is just people repackaging and saying ideas in different ways that we hadn't thought about before, but the ideas are still the same. And so 4,000 weeks is this very visual thing that like, if you live to 80, that's 4,000 weeks. That's how much you've got. Like that's not a lot of weeks. And so it's this, I think he says time management for mortals is the subtitle, which I think is so clever. And his idea being there will never be a thing that takes care of your work, of your to-do list, or of whatever. Like that's a false route to go towards, which is scary. But the answer then is just say no to a bunch of stuff and stop putting stuff on your plate. If I were really to boil it down and butcher the whole idea, that's kind of what it is that there will never be an end unless you say stop. It's this like basic idea. Like that's my takeaway from it. And I was reading Night Flight, and it's this idea that, you know, they're trying to do always more. And you can say like, oh, imagine we make like planes twice as fast or like anything. They're just going to move the dial. The goalpost moves. Right. And that's what we've been doing. Like you look at people working in a startup, like they're not going to die, but people are staying up late. They're breaking their relationships. They're not taking care of their health. Like they're doing all the things that happen in the book as well. But the technology has moved. And so I think it's just this really obvious thing when you take a giant step back in time. Like, oh, these people were going through the exact same thing. And they have this, they're also racing for their technology to win. And it was such a like vivid observation of like, oh, this is a false thing. Like there's no technology that's going to free me from my to-do list ever growing, or there's no way I'm going to automate things so much that I'm never going to have to do them again. Like I just need to be better at saying, do I want to play the game? Do I want to be the pilot in Riviere's world? In which case these are the rules and they're not going to change, or do I just walk away? And that's the real decision to make, rather than how can I kind of make it work without being like super stressed and not missing out on it.
Yeah, because you're never going to be.
Because that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a Zen bit of wisdom from this guy, I think Dojin Zenji. I should look this up, but he said there is no means to the end because the end is now. And the point being that like every moment you're alive is the culmination of everything that's ever existed.
Yeah.
You know, like this is the end. And that's a theme, absolutely a theme of Night Flight. I have a few notes here actually that relate to this. So this is from chapter 19. He says, "We do not pray for immortality," he thought, "but only not to see our acts and all things stripped suddenly of all their meaning. For then it is the utter emptiness of everything reveals itself." And then later he says, "The goal perhaps means nothing. It is the thing done that delivers man from death." And it's a theme throughout the whole story, is just sort of like our purpose in life is merely to do things. Like, and I would also say it's merely to do things like together. You know, because it is about it. It's about a team, and it's about individuals sacrificing themselves in a whole bunch of ways. He himself, you know, he's like, I don't get to have friendships. You know, it is my job to not be friends with these men because I can't get too close to them for us to do this bigger thing. And like, it's just this whole story of sacrifice in pursuit of this other thing, which is just a project larger than ourselves. And it's a tough pill to swallow. Like, it's not like it's and actually, I think there's another, I gotta find this. He mentions happiness explicitly a few times. Yeah, he says, man's happiness lies not in freedom, but in his acceptance of a duty. That's from the intro, I think.
Yeah, this is, I don't know if we really touched on this, but one of the things that I've been drawn to the books that we've talked about in that kind of time period is this notion that, especially around the Edelpost of the airmail, like these people were ready to dial for letters. If you really let that notion think in, you're like, that's absurd. That's like stupid.
Yeah.
But then you think about, well, it's absurd, but if that's the only means of communication, like those letters carry some of the most important information between people. Like there's love letters of people, there's billing accountants and like tax that are being paid and people that are called for specific duties and things like that. So now all of a sudden there's like a certain importance. If you said, you know, you have to risk your life to make sure the internet doesn't go down, like you're like, okay, that's a bit dramatic, but like,
yeah,
it's pretty bad if the internet went down. And so there's also of the fact that it's just from a different time. These people just came out from World War I. There's this sense of duty that just comes up a lot. Like these people, they're a part of something bigger and they're willing to put their life on it. There's this very real story in Pilote de Guerre, which is the one about where he's a warfighter. He I think dedicates his book to like another one of his pilots. I think it's this one. But there's a pilot that they're going over the whatever the name of the mountains in Argentina or Chile is. Like there's these very big mountains they have to go over. And so they have these airplanes. Sorry?
The Andes?
Yeah, the Andes. There we go. Thank you. I just didn't know how to say it in English. They have these airplanes whose maximum ceiling is below the height of these mountains. So airplanes are limited by how high they can fly because they need a certain amount of density of air for their wings. And more importantly, they need air for the engines. It's just like a car engine. You need air intake. And if there's not enough, the engine goes down, plane goes down. And so these people are flying airplanes whose maximum ceiling level it's rated at is below the height of the mountains, which is just this terrifying idea.
Right.
And one of them crashes in the winter. And these people are navigating with a compass and a paper map. Like that's kind of the level of where we are. So he doesn't really know where he is. And this guy is basically going to spend 3 days and 3 nights in the Andes, in the mountains, with very, very rudimentary survival kits and survival stuff. And eventually he says, like, I need to leave the plane. Like, he made it through. That's how we know these stories, is he eventually made it through. And Saint-Exupéry went to find him, not in the mountains, but below. And he starts taking the mail with him. So imagine this guy, you crash in a wooden airplane, and you need to get the hell out of there because you're going to freeze to death. This guy carries the airmail with him. Like, that's how dedicated these people are.
It's
I don't
amazing.
know if he made it all the way through with the mail at first, but at first he's really carrying it. Like, it's not a thing you leave behind. It's just this dedication that's being put in these people's mindset that's just both really inspiring and also makes you just think twice about. But there's this dedication that at least it makes you think about being a part of something so big that you're not only going to risk your life, when your life really is at risk, you're going to still take more risk. That I think I just think about every once in a while. I think the world we live in is quite different from that. And I just don't know what to make of it.
Well, I think that to me is what's so fascinating about this book. And then I think also about like a lot of, I would just say, like, the information technology world that we live in. I talked about this on a presentation recently, a few presentations I've given recently, about this thing that's called the Mickey Mat. I need to find it. It's the military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank so complex.
What?
Which is like, so there's the idea of there's like the military industrial complex, but then there's like the riff on this is that it's actually not just the military, it's industry, Congress, the intelligence sector, media and academia. They're all in this and creating this complex. But the joke being that's like, it's a massive part of our entire economy is just about us communicating. It's just sharing information.
Yeah.
And I'm like, is this just evidence of some weird thing about humans? Is that like, we always have some sort of message that we want to deliver. Like, we want to connect with people. We connect with people through language. It's such a core part of what we do. And the story you just told is just evidence of that. That like, you're like, got to get the mail. Yeah. I mean, like and that people will sacrifice themselves just to deliver a message. That's the story of the marathon. You know, it's running from Sparta.
Marathon to Athens.
Is it running from Marathon to Athens? Okay, running from Marathon to Athens, like to deliver the message of the war, and then dying. I
don't know. Yeah, I'm curious for that story. I've also gone through a giant rabbit hole of the Peloponnesian Wars recently, so like that's very fresh as well. Like,
Peloponnesian, I think.
Yeah, I struggle. But basically, how just completely stupid it is that the Greeks won that war as well, like and how dedicated these people were. Like, it's just so fascinating as well. Like, just history is amazing.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, you speak Spanish, don't you?
I do.
Like, are you fluent?
I am fluent in Spanish, I would say. I noticed recently I was trying to write an email to somebody in Spanish, and it was harder than it used to be. Right. Because I don't practice as much as I used to.
How come?
I used to read a novel in Spanish every year. It's just why don't I practice as much?
No. How come you're fluent in Spanish?
Oh, okay. So I was a Mormon missionary. So I was raised Mormon.
Okay.
I'm not super religious anymore, but it's the best possible way to learn a language though, because I lived in Venezuela for 2 years, and your job as a missionary is to talk to as many people as you can, like all day. So.
Wow. Okay.
It's a great
man. I have so many more questions. Like, that is such a pivot in your life.
Huge.
Because it's also about convincing people. Like, it's just like the same topic.
It absolutely is. It's without, I don't want to disparage the church or anything like that, because I have some affection for it, even though it's not a big part of my life anymore. But it's a sales job, fundamentally. You're there, you have an idea, you want to convince people it's a good idea, to the point that you want them to, really change their lives, based on accepting it. And as a missionary, the idea is that you're very, convicted about it. Like you're fully convinced, and you really have to demonstrate that to convince people like this is something that's going to improve their lives. Yeah, it's crazy. I would say I've never been a great salesperson, though. I'm not sure if I was a great missionary. I was also not like the most enthusiastic or devout person. I mean, that like I was a good Mormon and everything like that, but I wasn't.
How did you leave? That's probably a long story. But I don't know if you want to get into it, but like that is also a big pivot.
It was, it happened throughout my 20s, and it was just sort of a gradual realization that I actually just didn't believe in the church, like fundamentally. And there was just a lot of cognitive dissonance that just became harder and harder to live with, which is that like I didn't want to pretend that I believed in it when I just really didn't. To me, I just wasn't convinced. And so it's really funny when I went to grad school in San Diego. So I moved from home, like where I grew up in the DC area, across the country to San Diego, and I'm like 26 at the time. And I was like, am I in or out? Like, I need to like make a decision, because it's kind of like, I'm in my mid 20s. As far as Mormons go, like I should have been married already and like started having kids, like because they get married, have kids young. And I'm like, it's time to get on with my life. Like, am I going to be in the church or not? And I was like, I went out to San Diego and I'm like, I'm going to do it. Like, I'm going to be in the church. Like, I'm just going to like make the decision and be Mormon. And I lasted like 2 weeks. Like I'm like, actually, no, like I can't, like, I just don't believe in it. And so, I was very lucky in that like my family is very cool. They, everyone in my family is kind of has like at a different level of like their relationship to the church, like from very devout to like middle of the road to like, again, like anti. So when I like came out, as it were, to my family, or like when it became clear that I was like no longer like into the church, it wasn't catastrophic. It was a very easy exit for me. Whereas, I think some other people that have more devout families, it's been hard on them, because it's like, okay, well, don't come home for the holidays. I mean, that's a very extreme example that I don't really know anybody who's had that experience. But I know it's been hard. It's harder for certain people. It was easy for me. So yeah, I actually, I love talking about religion, and it's, I still consider myself Christian in a weird way. I'm like an atheist Christian. Like, I don't really necessarily believe in any of the.
Can you explain that?
The miracle. Well, yeah, in the sense that like I think Christian philosophy is really powerful. I think Christ was like a mystic figure. There are a lot of mystics throughout history, and just a wonderfully powerful teacher. My take is that he would have never created a church. Nothing, from at least the way that I interpret what he had to teach, required the creation of any kind of like administrative bureaucracy, which I think a lot of our notion of churches is actually just kind of like vestiges of the Roman Empire, and the hierarchy embedded there. And that's kind of like where I think people's notions of churches have come from. I think Jesus had a lot to teach about. I think about the Little Prince as well. Like, just being able to take a step back and recognize like what a gift it is to exist, and where true freedom comes from is not focusing so much on yourself, or your dominance over other people. So anyway, and so, but in terms of like me being an atheist Christian, I don't necessarily believe that he was resurrected or that he was the Son of God or any of that sort of stuff. Like, that doesn't matter to me. I don't think it's relevant to the teachings or the application of the teachings.
Understand. Yeah.
I'm glad you're asking this stuff, because I actually do love talking about this stuff, but like I would never voluntarily talk.
Well, this is why we're doing these like 2-hour-long conversations, man. Like the good stuff comes here.
I guess you're right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think like, I guess what I'd say is that like the story I think the story of Jesus it's a very powerful and extremely radical story. Still, his teaching is very radical. So you have the idea that like, and you know, I might be wrong about this. So even though I was a missionary, like I've read the Bible, like, but people can fight me on this. I don't care. But you have the idea of like, you've got Israel occupied by the Romans, who are like the worst, horrific occupiers. I mean, literally crucifying people, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have this guy, and they're waiting for a Messiah. Like there's this notion within their culture and their lore that like God is going to send someone to save us from this and deliver us from this. And then the idea is that Jesus is the Messiah, and he shows up. He's like, hey, guess what? Here's how you're going to be free. Love people and appreciate like just the, I mean, when he talks about the kingdom of heaven on earth, I think it's just sort of like understand what a gift you have being alive and being with other people. And they're like, oh, this sucks. You know, I mean, I think a lot of people are like this. Nope. Like, we're not buying that. Like, we hate the Romans. And I think Dune, you know, since I've spent a lot of the episodes of this podcast talking about Dune, I think Dune actually helps like put a fine point on this. Is it's like Paul, you know, the Messiah of Dune, being like, hey, you know what you should do? Love the Harkonnens. People are like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to love the Harkonnens. Like, these are the worst, most awful people. And it's like, no, true freedom will come from you being able to like enjoy your life now and loving the people around you and serving them and not worrying about yourself and not worrying about winning. It's an insane, profoundly radical lesson. And it's universally applicable throughout all eternity. In the United States right now, I live in Seattle, like very liberal, sort of like left-leaning city. If I were to go out to like a lot of my neighbors and be like, you know what, you should love Trump voters, they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, so there's always this, you know, this contention within humans of us like othering one another. And I think that there's something really, you know, I think there's something to be taken from the idea that like, you know, maybe we shouldn't do that, and that freedom comes from our ability to transcend that. So that's my, if you're interested in joining the Mormon church now, let me know and I'll send missionaries to your house.
That's not quite my vibe, but I appreciate you sharing that. I know.
I don't think they would not have anything. I'm not sure if they would agree with what I just said anyway. So
when I was like, when I was bored, I admit it was when I was bored. I've just gone to talk to like Mormon people in the street, and I'm like, yo, what are you guys up to? I've done it a couple of times, and it's like
amazing,
pretty interesting. I mean, I think it's no surprise. I just like talking to people, like asking them questions.
Yeah,
follow the curiosity. I think it's just like the same trope here every time.
Yeah, no, I think that's really wise. Also, and it also kind of like, I think that's eternal wisdom. There's always going to be something else to learn. Like, there's always another conversation to have. And I think it's great. I think it gives our lives meaning.
I wanted to, the reason I asked about if you spoke another language.
Oh yeah.
Is,
wait, long tangent.
No. Do you speak any other language, like fluent level, I mean?
I speak, this is a joke. I speak fluent Portuñol. So I also speak Portuguese decently well.
Okay.
But it's enough to like just get myself in trouble, because I can be really conversational. I think I have a pretty good accent, at least like for Brazilian Portuguese. But then like my vocabulary is like very limited, and so I can have like very diplomatic kind of, you know, nice to meet you, where you're from, et cetera, et cetera. Like, and then whenever I hit a wall, I just use a Spanish word, and you can get pretty far with that. But it's not enough to have like long, deep conversations.
I see. So
nothing like, I mean, I can't do what you're doing, and I don't think I could do what you're doing in Spanish. It would take me a long time to warm up to be able to have a conversation like this in Spanish. No.
Oh, this took many years. The reason I speak English the way I do is because my family went to live in Australia when I was a kid for a few years.
Oh.
So I joke around that I buried my French accent deep in the Australian bush. But then like
you did a great job. Yeah.
But then like the vocabulary, like I had the accent and the grammar of a 6-year-old, and then, which is great because the accent you can't really learn it after, but the vocabulary that is still a work in progress.
Yeah.
And the articulation and prose and all of that's still taking some time. But
it's very impressive.
Thank you. It's also one of the things I'm most grateful for. I probably would not be able to make a podcast if that weren't the case. If I speak like this for 2 hours, I don't think the people would be listening to me as much. So I'm very grateful
Perhaps
that I don't speak like the normal French person,
It's very charming. But yeah, maybe you're right. After 2 hours, people will be like,
yeah,
right,
it's this kind of truth that nobody likes talking about, that a lot of people listen to you because they like your voice more than, or the way that you speak more than the ideas that you have, which is this thing that we don't want to hear. But I've had people who told me that, like, oh, I stopped listening to this because I just didn't like the voice. I'm like, but the ideas are cool. And they're like, nah.
No, this is something I talk about a lot with our team and like my board and like with our strategy for Radiant Earth, is like, how do we come across, like, branding is I sum this all up in branding.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a term that it was a conversation with Chris Holmes, fellow geospatial luminary, and then a woman named Jen Marcus, who runs the Taylor Geospatial Engine. And I think Jen came up with the term, which was the vibe index, which is sort of like, in the technology world, there's so much, like, so many crazy ideas being thrown out, so many like products being launched, initiatives being launched, etc. And there's a vibe index, which is like, how much of it is just vibes and how much of it is real. And so if it's like zero vibes, is just sort of like, it's hardcore, pure, real product that matters, and like there's no BS at all. And then the 10 on the vibes index is like flashy website, like crazy animations, like blah blah blah, like lots of buzzwords, but there's no actual information, there's no substance. And I would, maybe there might not be any surprise here, but like Jen, Chris, and I are kind of like, we want to be on the zero vibes end of things. But to your point, you're going to miss a lot of people if you just come out with like, a black and white document,
I'm going to push
Times
back
New
on
Roman
that.
font.
I'm going to say that the other tip of the scale is not real, because vibes are real. They're a very real thing. The example, there's two examples that I take on like two extremes. The first one is GDAL. I love GDAL. GDAL
is a perfect example.
I would never, I owe my career to GDAL. It's amazing, but it's like -10 on the vibes scale. To the point where like it puts people off. And that's
right.
a very real impact thing. The barrier to entry is too high, in my opinion. Even for like technical documentation, it's just like, so for people who might not be aware, because there's like, if you go look up gdal.org, that's all you need to know. Yeah. You'll see what we're talking about.
Put it in the show notes. Yeah.
It's just it's awful. And I'm
right.
That's the first reaction. I just really remember a few years ago, people were talking about it going, and I'm like, oh, I don't know what this is. Let me go to YouTube. Is someone talking about what this thing is? No. Okay, now I need to actually do some proper reading. That's like a genuine reaction. Like I went to YouTube to be like, does someone explain how this works? So I understand this idea, and this is something I think a lot about. Like, is there some like actual hardcore stuff behind it, or is it just flashy animations? But I think I really want to push back on real. I think is not the proper way to define it, because unfortunately the vibes are real as well. It's really what people vibe with. That's why it's a good notion. The second example I wanted to bring up is the complete counter opposite, which is ChatGPT. And the idea being, it's very high on the hardcore level, if we call it that. But it's very high on the vibes as well. Bruno Sanchez talks about this a lot. He's thinking about foundation models and clay. I know you guys are working together. And so he says like that the reason ChatGPT took off is because there was a front end. because we had
That's right.
GPT-2 already. Like I remember watching Computer File and like people talking about GPT-2 being like, "Well, this thing is pretty good. Like it's actually legit cool." And that's like 2019, something like that. But the reason, the moment where it like blows up to the point where we talk about it is like whatever, November, December 22, and where it's a front end and you can just type anything and like immediately it's way more accessible. So in terms of, it's not flashy, but I would put it in like 10 on the vibes scale. It is really high. And that matters so much. Like in a way, it even matters more than what's behind it sometimes. Like some of the most useful websites, like you don't actually really care. I don't care what the back end of Wikipedia is. Like it doesn't really matter. Like it has to be easy to navigate because that's what I want. But like I don't actually care if it's just plain JavaScript everywhere. Like yeah, it's just text anyways. Like it could be a little bit faster or anything, but there are some things where it matters, others where it doesn't. But I like this slider idea. I see it more as a 2D thing than like.
Okay. So yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and you want to be like top right.
There's a quadrants. That's right. Yeah, exactly. You do need both, but it also depends on your audience, right? So like GDAL's audience, for the most part, let's say 80% of GDAL users are probably served perfectly well by the site that exists right now. There could be, there's another audience out there that's just like turned off by it, right?
Exactly.
And, there's some room for movement there. But like so this is going back to what I was saying before about like, how deep in the weeds do I want to get about like OLAP databases or something like that? When talking to funders, I have to know my audience, right? And so so your audience, it depends on your audience and like how large you want it to be, or like what you expect them to understand. That's going to determine like in what like vibes to substance quadrant do you have to be in. And I'm going to tie it back to these books.
I want to come back to languages again. Like there's a thing I wanted to get to about languages.
Oh, sure. Okay. But it's Saint-Exupéry is such a gift because he's clearly like a profound, like a deeply knowledgeable technician about, aviation and these planes, and just such a poet, and just wrote about it so beautifully. And I don't think, there are people, right? I mean, Ted Chiang, I know we're both fans of Ted Chiang. We do have writers these days that can write about technology in somewhat more poetic ways, but Saint-Exupéry is just a gift. But anyway,
and also like you don't have to. Like I've been reading Ashley Vance recently. I'm going to have him on the podcast. The first guy who made he did the first biography of Musk, and now he made When the Heavens Went on Sale. He's a reporter, and his books are amazing.
Right.
And he's not an engineer, but he reports really well. So like there are counterexamples in this industry that are very good.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask about language is first as a remark, and then I'll let you riff off from there. I am very grateful that I am fluent in both French and English. Like I've said multiple times, I think if you want to expand your mind as a human being, learn a language that, I'm going to use that word again, orthogonal, is as different from the one that you know as much as possible. So most likely people listening to this speak English. Go learn Mandarin.
Right.
Because if you want to open yourself up to ideas that you just maybe even can't, your brain just can't access, like learning a different language and then being into those is really, it just expands your world. And I think there's a limited subset of those languages. The first three that come to mind is Mandarin, Russian, and French. And there's like three reasons for that, is because they're quite different from English, like French being the closest, and it's Russian and then Mandarin. Culturally, these countries are quite isolated from each other. So there's a lot of American culture that makes its way into French culture, but it doesn't go the other way around. Very little, like a little bit.
Only Daft Punk.
Daft Punk and the Little Prince. But like I've joked around as well, and I've poked this idea that like France is the US of Europe culturally. And what I mean by that is
I think I've heard this. Yeah.
a lot of the US is, and I'm sorry for American people, but this is my point of view, is very self-centered. It's like there's the US and then there's the rest of the world. If you go traveling somewhere and you ask people where they're from, they're gonna be like, I'm from Sweden, I'm from India, and then they're gonna be like, I'm from Seattle. And you're like,
Right. What?
or the worst is I'm from Georgia. And then you're like, oh, cool. So you're not that far. And they're like, what do you mean? Like, or you hear like a thick accent and you're like, what? No. For me, it's just a prime example of like your view of the world. Like, if you are not, maybe British is like also a little bit, but like if you live in another place, you're very aware. There's the US, there's your country, there's the rest of the world. And France is one of those places that's still very isolated culturally because French is so widely spoken that everything that comes in the country is dubbed in French. So you go see a Marvel movie, it's in French. There's Bruce Willis has his designated actor that does just Bruce Willis's voice in French. So most people, they don't know Bruce Willis's actual voice. They know the translator, the dubber. All the references are put in French to the point where the biggest complaints on the App Store in France for like non-French apps are this app sucks, it's not in French. Like there is this expectation that anything that you touch your hands on should be in French, regardless of where it comes from. And so it creates this view of the world where France is the center of the world. There's a little bit the US and then there's something else. And so I feel like I have access to a parallel universe in a way. Where there's a little bit of connection between the two, but not that much. There's not very much overlap between what French people think of Americans is still like this far away thing. Like it's Americans and they're all these stereotypes of Americans and like all of that. And then you go to the US and there's all these stereotypical people of like Europe and like the French and all that stuff. And like I get to sit in the middle and just like hop around from one to the other. And there's many ways in which that comes across, which is like reading the news is very interesting. But literature is another one where there hasn't been as much influence on each other. Cinema is the same. France is a huge cinema country. And so this is why I also spoke about Russia and Mandarin. Those are still places where the culture doesn't come in contact very much. And the languages and the cultures are very, very rich. So if you go, and maybe Spanish, I'm not aware as much, but like if you go learn some of these languages, you have access to these parallel universes that like you can read translated works, but it's different because the ideas are expressed still differently. And there's the historical context, the cultural context behind all of these. The most recent example, I went to see Napoleon, and it was just so weird to hear all these places in English. It's just like this, it's still the same, like you're telling the story, but it's very different. And so I really think about this idea of like, if you're a human being, the best thing so far that I've experienced is to like learn a different language from a part of the world that's still like really isolated. Maybe like Hindu is the same as well. But like that's kind of my recommendation for fellow humans. And I'm curious if you've experienced some of that through Spanish, which is kind of what I had in the back of my head when I asked that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, go be a Mormon missionary. Well, I mean, I do want, I'm not like, I've got 3 kids, like we're not raising them in the church, and I lament, like they're not going to go on missions, but I do want to find a way, like, how do I ship them overseas? Like, we lived in Munich for 3 years when I worked for AWS. And so my oldest kids learned German, and they've since forgotten it completely. I think the muscle memory's there. But my daughter went to 1st and 2nd grade in German public school and spoke like fluent German, like had this perfect like Bavarian accent, which it just blew people's minds. And yeah, like I very much want that for my kids. if you can't learn the language, at least like see the world, like just go. I mean, for me, I love like traveling internationally and then just like putting on the news, because you get the sort of like international versions of CNN and whatever, and you're like, oh my God, like there's a whole world out here that doesn't care anything about like nonsense that's happening in America. And I just think that's it's very important to experience that perspective like regularly. But language itself is a whole other thing, because speaking of Ted Chiang again, the story that Arrival's based on, the story of your life, I think is what the
stories,
story
I
is
think
called.
Plural. I'm not sure.
Yeah. But it's about an alien language,
Yes.
that transforms the way we perceive time and our own lives. But that's what language actually does. And it's funny, I'm trying to think of like what I've gotten from Spanish, specifically in terms of like mind expanding stuff. And I think it's hard for me to think of anything because I've spoken it for so long. I mean, I've been a fluent Spanish speaker for 26 years or something. Living in Germany, I learned the word for outer space in German, which blew my mind, which is Weltraum. And I don't have any kind of German accent. Weltraum. I don't know if I say it. It's world room. And I love it. It's so beautiful to me. And I think it's just like so naive and wonderful, and kind of silly. That's like, oh, space, that's the room that the world is in, as if it exists for us. And I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's the kind of thing where, there's just different bits of poetry in different languages.
Yeah.
Regardless, like I sort of bristle against the idea of like sort of the practical application of learning other languages. I think it just makes your life better, generally.
I think there are a few things that we lose with technology. Like overall, it's a net positive, but we do lose a few things. Like we're not as manual as people used to be. We're probably going to become worse writers with ChatGPT. Like overall, like
definitely,
the common pool of humans is going to become worse. And I think your AirPods are going to be able to live translate, in a few years. Like that's coming. So the mental hurdle of like learning, the cost of learning a language is going to become harder and harder to justify. But I think there is like, this is the one thing where can we hold on that one just a little longer? Like I'm not keen on that happening anytime soon. Like
to take it back to Night Flight and like why I want Christopher Nolan to make a movie about this is that like Patagonia, Argentina, like I've been lucky to I've visited Argentina, I don't know, like 4 or 5 times in my life. I've been to Patagonia once. I did a study abroad in Chile. Like I love that part of the world. And also Latin America is, a sort of perennially sad story in a lot of ways because it's just sort of left behind by so much of the rest of the world. And there's just such beautiful history there. And so reading this book, I was like, I want to be here. Like I want to be in Patagonia and Buenos Aires in like early 20th century just to see what it was like. And like, so I'm just like, somebody very talented needs to make a period piece movie so that I can like see this. And I talked about this in my most recent episode of this podcast with George Dyson, where we also sort of talk about like just technology, just generally sort of steamrolling the planet. And in his book Analogia is very much about like, exploring human cultures, even pre-written language, like what they were like and how they lived and like how that's all lost. And I mentioned Miyazaki. So Miyazaki films, the guy that did Spirited Away and stuff like that. This is a theme through so many of his movies is of like the world that's been lost, right? And it's just all about the world that's been lost. And anyway, time marches on, and I think, when I was reading Night Flight, I was thinking of the movie Midnight in Paris, by Woody Allen. Do you know that Woody?
No.
It's a great movie, because it's about how whatever the golden age is, it's always sometime before when you're alive now. And so, future generations are going to be like, oh man, Remember those early days of podcasting? Like the minds behind maps days. Like that was the golden age of podcasting. It'll always be looking back on whatever we're doing now as like some sort of golden age. And I think that's just how humans perceive time in our history as a species.
I've thought about this notion as well, where looking up Saint-Exupéry, he struggled with this idea that like some of the people that he based his story on didn't like being portrayed in whatever way, or they didn't like that he could benefit from their stories. Like he get the fame, and he kind of betrayed, being one of them, because he transcended that.
Right.
And I think about that, and then I think about reading these stories 80 years later, where we wouldn't know who these people are were it not for Saint-Exupéry. And so there's this weird thing, this weird dilemma between the people who record things that aren't contributing right now, right here, right now. You're not helping us by writing the thing. You could be hands-on and doing the thing. But like, if nobody does that, we never know it happened. And like, what is more valuable? I have no idea, but it's something that I just thought to myself reading this thing. Like, I know these people. Like, we can talk about Didier Dora, which is the person that Rivière is based on. We can talk about Aéropostale. We can talk about all these places because this person became so famous talking about them.
Right.
I went down listening to, do you know Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast?
I know about it. I've never listened to it. I know people love it.
I've just discovered, like, spend time listening to it. And so that's the episodes that I listened to were about the Greek Wars with the Persians, at the height of Athens and Sparta. And what I particularly enjoyed is that he's not just telling the story. He's telling what we know and what we don't know about the story. And so he's saying, like, you got to remember, like, these Persians, like, we actually only know about them from what the Greeks wrote. So you have these people who are saying, we're being invaded by these people. Look at how awful they are. But if you want to actually understand what's happening, you got to imagine what it's like for them. It's like if all that was left of Nazi Germany was what the US wrote. You'd be like, oh, these people are like, of course, absolutely horrible and everything. But then, like, it takes mental gymnastics to be like, why did that happen in the first place? Because there's no written record of it. And that's just this idea that I was like, oh, this is so interesting, of you're trying to piece together what people are writing that are very emotional about what's happening to them and have a very different literary style than we do now. And so you have to try to break that apart and piece together, like, why are these people invading them in the first place? And what is the reaction, and to get to what actually happened? It's just fascinating.
Yeah. And all that's, all that information is lost. It's hidden from us. It's so hard to understand. And I think that reading Night Flight and reading about Rivière, I was just like, why is this guy such a dick? Like, it's like, sorry, this is the spiciest language I think I've used on this podcast, but I'm just like, and I'm like, oh, like, well, this is clearly, like, he's coming out of a military tradition of management, and, like, and also, like, people's lives are at stake and so forth. And so, like, I had sort of similar thoughts to you in terms of, like, comparing what they were doing to something like a startup. And I'm like, this is not how you manage people these days. You want to be, a cooler manager, etc. Like, you wouldn't want morale to be so low, and just be, like, so harsh. But, he's coming from a completely different perspective. And thanks to Saint-Exupéry, we have a record of sort of what these operations were like. But you kind of have to read between the lines to understand, like, why they were like that. And like, I think it's great that we as humans try to record these things and try to understand them and explain what we do. But man, I don't think many humans even understand why they do whatever they do anyway, like, day to day.
Curiosity. That's all you need.
It's curiosity, but it's all, that's curiosity. I mean, it's, you want to be comfortable and fed and have people take care of you, or, like know that you're loved and so forth. And so I think there's some very primal drives that drive us, but like we don't necessarily understand them. And so it's really interesting to observe, to study history or read something like Night Flight and try to understand like why are we doing the things that we do collectively. It's very weird.
You started a podcast. You started recording
Correct.
Conversations. Why?
Yeah.
What are you trying to get out of it?
I think I've said this, like, I just wanted to have these conversations. And I've said also you were an inspiration for me because I'd listen to your podcast and you'd ask people about books. And I was like, this is what I want to talk about. But there's also, so there's just the selfish thing. Like for me, I've been doing this for a year now. I mean, I recorded my episode with Tim a year ago. It took me like half a year to publish that episode. But, it's been shocking to me how gratifying it is. Like, I'm so glad that I started doing this because I just want to have these conversations. But a big part of the motivation was, and I should actually I journal very religiously, like every day. And I should probably try to find like my earliest instances of this. But like the original idea, I think I've said this before on the podcast, I wanted to create a college course called Applied Borges, which is like a computer science course, but where we would read Borges stories and like use them to understand like information architectures and stuff like that. And I was like, that'd be a cool thing to do in my life if I could pull that off. And then, but then I somehow determined like the podcast is a better medium for this because you can just reach so many more people. And then the other part of it was that like, I worked at Amazon for 8 years and found myself eventually just surrounded by engineers and, people with masters in business administration, who were like, I don't want to rag on everybody at Amazon. I have great friends there, but like, there were a lot of people there who aren't curious. They're like, my job is to make this number go up. My job is to hit this target, that's what we're doing here. And it kind of gave me the creeps. And I was like, like, is this how we're going to be building technology? Like, not born of curiosity, but just born of like, let's make these numbers go up. At a certain point, if you build an enterprise, and Night Flight again is a story of this, of a machine that's being built, fed by young men's lives, in some instances. Like, it's like an engineering numbers game, that you end up playing. And I wanted to start this podcast to like take a step back and be like, no, like technology is made of people, and like what drives people are mysterious things. And literature is a great way to explore what those mysterious things are. And yeah, so that's a long answer, but I think that's why I did it. And it's fun. Turns out it's fun. Huge pain though also.
Tell me about it.
Can I just share one other thing from Little Prince? And then
yeah,
I need to get back to work. This is complete aside, but this hit me so hard. It's in chapter 21 when he finds the fox.
Yeah.
He says, "For me, you're only a little boy, just like 100,000 other little boys, and I have no need of you, and you have no need of me either. For you, I am only a fox like 100,000 other foxes. But if you tame me, we'll need each other. You'll be the only boy in the world for me. I'll be the only fox in the world for you. But if you tame me, my life will be filled with sunshine. I'll know the sound of footsteps that will be different from all the rest. Other footsteps send me back underground. Yours will call me out of my burrow like music." I mean, my God, this guy, like, I don't understand why more people don't talk about this book, because again, it's everywhere, but like, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I think this is, it's partially being a father. But it's not so much, I mean, it's also just about having a relationship with anyone. Like how hilarious it is that there are like billions of people on the planet. And that like we can mean so little to one another. But when we form relationships, when we have conversations, we make these connections, like it enriches our lives so much. It gives us gives so much meaning to us. And the fact that this was the book that he wrote when he did, especially now that I know like the historical context, is just like so powerful. It's a great gift. So I just want to thank you for prompting me to read it. It's been great.
I think it's the best definition of love that I've ever seen, that I didn't even know I expressed like that. And especially in today's world, where I think there's a lot of paralysis in the amount of choice that you have, like in friendships, in romantic partners. Like oh my God, there's like so many other people. Like there's someone better. There's another better fox that's like, his hair is just a little bit nicer, or he has nicer ear, this fox, or whatever. Like there's always going to be something else. But like for me, that's like I stopped on that one as well when I read it again. It's this idea that we're going to choose. It's arbitrary. Right. It's this notion that all it takes is us deciding we're going to tame each other. And to continue the analogy, but it's that word as well is, but.
Oh yeah. What is the word in French?
It's also
tame. I mean, how would you?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And it's the same thing for the flowers. The little prince goes in a garden of 5,000 flowers.
Right.
And he's just overwhelmed.
That's right.
Because there's too many flowers. But he says, like, no, I want to go back to my rose, to my flower. And then it even goes one step further when he goes away. The little prince dies at the end. We're past spoilers at this point. But the pilot is very sad, but he says, it's okay. You'll know that I'm one of those stars. And so all the stars are going to be beautiful because you're going to know I'm one of them. And there's this notion that, for me, like it's just such a powerful expression of like what of is. I don't really believe in this idea that you live happily ever after, or that there is such thing as like the one for you, like to go on the whole thing. I think like love is a decision that you make. It's a lot of hard work that you're going to be like, I'm just going to pick you because you're nice and I like being around you, and now we're going to put in the work to make it happen. And that is just such a beautiful way to put it. Like he writes, again, what I admire most about this book, if I were to summarize, is how simple it's written, because it's very hard to write these ideas in such a simple manner that like a kid can understand. But I'm glad we talked about this.
Yeah. Sorry, I gotta keep riffing on it a little bit about this, because I 100% agree with what you said. It is a choice, but he talks about this with the fox. He's like, this is gonna be, this will be hard because like we'll leave each other, at some point. And he's like, no, it's gonna be great. And he says, this is so funny. You see the wheat fields over there? This is the fox. He's like, I don't eat bread. For me, wheat is of no use whatsoever. Wheat fields say nothing to me, which is sad. But you have hair the color of gold, so it will be wonderful. Once you've tamed me, the wheat, which is golden, will remind me of you, and I'll love the sound of the wind in the wheat. And it's just like this beautiful, just so plain, but cuts right to the core of explaining like how loving other people gives meaning to our lives. And it's a choice, and it's like, you're going to choose someone. And I think it was Louis C.K. I mentioned Woody Allen and Louis C.K., which I think are both like somewhat canceled men.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think so. Yeah. No, whatever. But what Louis C.K. He's like, every relationship you enter in is going to end in like death or something. You should just FYI. And yeah, it's hilarious, right? And it's like, why do we do it? Like, why do people have pets? They're going to die and it's going to make you miserable. But it's like, no, because like it's because you love them and because it enriches your life, and like you would have it no other way. I could talk about this forever, but no, this book just two tremendous books. So thank you for bringing these to my attention.
And they're very short, so I really recommend. And Little Prince is free; you can find it everywhere. Go read it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Max. This will not be the only one we do, I'm sure, because I'm going to be doing this for a long time.
Longevity is the thing I'm going for as well.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I sufficiently edited out the part where I started crying towards the end there. But these are just powerful, wonderful, beautiful books. I think the Little Prince is it's a great wisdom book. Really, really hard to explain, but such a great read and the kind of thing that I know I'm going to pick up again. If you want to read ahead for next month, we're going to talk about a very short essay by Jorge Luis Borges with Jordan Tigani, who's the CEO of Mother Duck. Fascinating guy. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice that I am in a different spot. I'm in a new office. I moved to Connecticut with my family just this past month. I'm recording this at the end of August. And I'm going to be out here this fall. I'm teaching a class at Yale, at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale, on what I'm calling planetary scale data institutions. But I don't have a great pipeline for the podcast after September because I've been so busy with the move. But I am hoping to interview some people in person while I'm out here. So stay tuned for that. It's pretty exciting. As always, the intro music for this podcast is by Secret School. And the music that we're listening to right now is a song called 3/10 of the Population by We. If you're listening to this and you like it, leave a review, tell your friends, email me, jed@text.text.net, and let me know if you're listening. I want to hear suggestions on what to read. I can tell you my reading slate is insane right now, especially while I'm teaching and considering doing a bit of research while I'm at Yale. But I still want suggestions, so don't be shy. Regardless, I want to hear from you if you're listening. And I just have to keep manifesting. If you have any idea of like grants or any way to support this, I would love to get one because I want to hire an intern. I want to be able to pay somebody to help me work on this thing. So just let me know. jed@textontext.net. Would love to hear from you regardless. So thanks for listening, and we will see you next month.